As you all know, the Quantic community is chock full of incredible individuals all over the world who are doing important work that you may or may not know about. So today is an opportunity to hear more from one of your Quantic peers. Allow me to introduce you to Dr. Kim Reuter, who is a senior climate finance advisor at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as a 2016 National Geographic Explorer and a 2020 Churchill Fellow. Kim has spent more than a decade working in international development, environmental sustainability, and research in 22 countries around the world for Conservation International, the World Bank, WWF, and the Global Wildlife Conservation, with a PhD in wildlife trafficking issues based on research in Madagascar. Kim has authored over 40 publications, and a very recent one, I think, and her research has been featured by CNN International, National Geographic, Scientific American, and The Guardian. She has been the executive director of 2 nonprofit organizations and sits on the board of Lemur Love, Creative Member Network, and the Anglo-Malagasy Society. With a career spanning 15 years across 22 countries, Kim will reflect on lessons learned in the field of environmental sustainability and will challenge participants, you, to think about how they can participate in society's tipping point towards a more sustainable future. And without further ado, I give the time now to Kim.
Thanks, everyone. Let me now share my screen, hopefully seamlessly. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Sorry. Here we go. Share. Does that work? And it's full screen now?
Yes.
Amazing. So it's not every day that I get to start the day by having someone else tell 60 other people about my career, so I'm blushing a little bit. But I'm really looking forward to spending the next 20 minutes or so reflecting on my career. As Grace said, my name's Kim Reuter, and while I do work as a senior advisor for the UK government at the moment, I'm speaking today obviously on my personal opinions, so not on behalf of the UK government. So now that that disclaimer is out of the way, let's talk a little bit about society's tipping point towards sustainability. And then I'll talk a little bit about some lessons I've learned, trends, and how you can be part of that as well. So I wanted to start by showing this screenshot from Google Maps. What do people see here? What do they observe? Feel free to just, I know the rule was not to say yourself, keep muted, but feel free to unmute yourself.
French.
Oh, yeah, that's good. What else? What else do people see?
Protected area.
Oh, you got it. I needed a few more people to guess. But what do you see about the protected area?
There's sea and land. I believe sea or water anyways.
Yeah.
And mountains, a lot of green.
Okay.
And also a city, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all the names start with A.
Yeah, that's Madagascar for you. So what we're looking at here is Northwest Madagascar, where I used to work. So Madagascar is the 4th largest island in the world. It's one of the poorest. It's only one of 2 countries in the world that's lost wealth since the 1960s. And it's a case study for environmental degradation, which is why I did my PhD there. And what we're looking at here is, you can see that green blob in the center of the screen. That is the exact outline of a protected area. So what this means is that in Madagascar, all that's left of primary habitat of forest is in protected areas, and outside of it, it's very, very degraded. There's almost nothing left. So this is a country that's lost 90% of its habitat. And what I find interesting is that it's a case study for what we're seeing all around the world, which is environmental degradation, or almost like a death by 1,000 cuts. So I'm calling in right now from Southwest Florida, where I grew up, although I live generally in the UK. And it's the same here. When you're driving around Florida, you see lush green, there's no problems, there's beach bars everywhere, everyone's in a good mood. But it's not until you actually fly into Fort Myers, or in this case, into Madagascar. The last 20 minutes of the flight into Madagascar is where you really get to see what it looks like from 30,000 feet. Because on the ground, you might see a village like this. This is the village on the side of the protected area. They do ecotourism. You know, to a normal tourist, it might feel like everything's quite fine. You might see on the right a photo. This is a photo of a precious hardwood tree, which was taken out during the night under the cover of darkness from the protected area for the illegal trade. So you might see things like this, but you would never guess how bad it really is. And I think that's really been what's driving my career in sustainability, is to make people aware and to kind of pull them above to that 30,000 foot view so that we can do something about sustainability. So what's my story? Basically, maybe like a lot of you on this call, I started university without much of a clue of what I wanted to do. I signed up for biology because I wanted to be a doctor, but couldn't get the grades. I was a very bad student. And it wasn't until I was quite lost. And it wasn't until I had a professor who sort of evangelized about climate change that something clicked in my head. And, you know, growing up in Southwest Florida, even though we're at the forefront of climate change, we have hurricanes, sea level rise, there was just always doubt about what scientists are thinking. And there was this communication gap barrier, right? Like what scientists were thinking wasn't being communicated to the public. And all of a sudden I had this professor who was just, you know, telling us, you know, our careers, if we decided to go in biology, would be dominated by this. And even more, like, I think even more tellingly at the time, I remember being told there was a statistical likelihood that there would be a pandemic during my career. Another flu or another virus crossing a species boundary, which of course we've been living through for the last year. And so that was really what set the trajectory of my career. And aside from that, what I also got was my standard in front of a microscope picture, which I've included for you here, because my student paper thought you couldn't be a scientist unless you had a stock photo in front of a microscope, even though I've never done microbiology. I graduated into the recession, so there were no jobs for biologists unless you wanted to work for big pharma. So I took the only job I could get, which was as an unpaid field assistant in Equatorial Guinea, which is this photo of me walking on the beach. And what I did there for 2 months, I lived in a rainforest camp tracking illegal primate hunters in literally an uncharted area. So the last time this area of the forest had been mapped was in the 1960s by the Spanish. So aside from the fact that I realized that I could in fact go without Facebook, which was just starting at the time, because all we had was a satellite phone, was I realized that fortress conservation, which is basically the David Attenborough generation, where they would go in and almost like a fortress, put you know, barriers up around protected areas and more or less tell local communities that they weren't allowed to use it, that it wasn't working. And even in this protected area, this is back in 2010, 2011, we were in the middle of nowhere and there were piles of plastic coming up on the beach from all over the world because of the currents there. So I went through the same thought process that a lot of young people do. You know, I started an NGO thinking I could fix it all. I had my white savior moments. And in the end, I did my PhD in wildlife trafficking work, which was where the next really big move came in my career. So that's me on a scooter in Madagascar, scooting between markets. I was trying to get people to trust me, to tell me about all the illegal stuff they were doing. This is my colleague here interviewing someone in the back of a truck. He would illegally move wildlife, which sells in China, you know, for tens of thousands of dollars sometimes. And then this is me with an illegal pet lemur. So I would say it's not a very good moment for the lemur, but it was a good moment for my career, where one evening I went to my favorite bar and for a drink, and they suddenly had this lemur. And it occurred to me that just like in many other places in the world, most of the science that had been done in Madagascar was done by Western scientists who never stayed in cities. They always went to forests. And so no one had ever published on this part of the trade. And it might seem like a very niche subject, but sorry, could you mute yourself, please? Thank you. It might seem like a very niche subject, but no one had ever published on it. And it gave me a platform to not only do my research, but to try and influence policy on it. And in the end, I was able to work with the Malagasy government. They didn't change much, but at least they became aware that this was a problem, that I don't think people understood the gravity of the situation, how many lemurs were being extracted from the wild for the pet trade. This then took me into where I would say the bulk of my career sits, and maybe where a lot of the lessons that I've learned have come from, which was I realized I was very good at making the business case for nature. And I started doing this for both governments and for business. Particularly, I was brought in as a senior technical director for something called the Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability in Africa. This was founded in 2012, had 12 countries. And at this time, those African countries were basically saying, we know that something has to change. And so what I would do is I would go and speak to senior decision makers about something called natural capital accounting, which again sounds incredibly boring, but the gist is the way that businesses and governments account for their assets completely ignores nature. And as a result, it's giving nature a value of 0. And when something has a value of 0, what we've seen, it's treated as if it has no value. So for an example, you might see the Chinese government's accounts. Their GDP is good. I mean, there are political reasons for why their GDP is always so good. But the point is they show growth year on year, year on year, year in, year out. It doesn't matter what's happening. But if you were to internalize the cost of the degradation, pollution costs on people's lungs, lack of water, dirty water, the reduction of their natural asset stock, you'd probably see that the GDP was either not growing near as fast enough or that they had negative growth. And it's the same with businesses. I would meet with businesses primarily in Africa who'd never ever considered that their supply chain was so closely linked to nature that if they didn't start to consider this in their accounts, they had a serious, they were blind to a serious risk. I'm not sure if the slides will be shared later, but I have linked to a video there, which is a 2-minute video where different senior stakeholders in Africa talk about why this is important to them. But you can also Google the Gaborone Declaration and kind of see what this looks like at a political level. I want to reflect a little bit here on this picture on the left, because I think this really describes what my job was for a few years. Usually the only woman in the room, trying to talk to people in positions of power and convince them that thinking about nature, thinking about the environment is not just about running around and hugging trees and becoming vegan. It's about good decision making. And in this case, we're having a ad hoc meeting with the Minister of Environment in Uganda. And this meeting always sticks with me in my mind because it was such a perfect encapsulation of the problem that we were facing. This Minister of Environment was a political appointee, 0 background environment, really a very base understanding of why this was important beyond that some tourists would pay a bunch of money to fly in and go to a protected area, right? We had this meeting on the sidelines. It was a courtesy meeting. It wasn't, he told us what we needed to hear. We delivered our lines, but I left thinking that more work had to be done. We hadn't landed our message. And sure enough, and it was telling, we got a meeting, so that was a good thing. You only get meetings with ministers if someone in their team thinks you're saying something that makes sense. But a few months later, when I left this job, I became a consultant for a consulting firm in the UK, which was hired by a large oil and gas company to do the advising on Uganda's first oil and gas project. And the Ugandan government had approved for this to be right in the middle of one of their most popular protected areas. And so it was just this moment in my career where I thought, I've been fighting for 10 years to get people to understand that this matters to them, and the message wasn't landing. So it'd be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and the decisions made, which make good sense on paper for human development or society's development. For those reasons, in 10, 20, 30 years, I think the next generation would really regret that those decisions were made. So I want to reflect a little bit on what I've learned. And this is where I'd also like to challenge colleagues on the call to think about whether you think this is the same in other, in your areas of expertise, because I find that anytime there's a new thing that's becoming important, these tend to be true, whether it's the environment or human rights or what have you. And so what I've learned in the last 15 years of trying to convince people that sustainability matters is that, first of all, mismatching timelines are a big problem. If you put the pure extractives industries to one side, from almost every other business, every other government, even on your individual household level, it always makes most financial sense to to consider environmental sustainability. It almost always does. Your cost benefit analysis will almost always be better if you include the environment. But stakeholders just don't do it. Politicians, governments, businesses, their timelines are too short. You know, they're looking at 1, 2, 4, 6 year timelines, and the environment takes 10, 20 years. So what you end up having is that people sometimes think they're making a good decision, but if you were to expand out the timeline for their cost benefit analysis, it's a terrible decision. It's the worst thing you could do. And you, it really, when you make 1,000 decisions, it ends up all on the wrong information or incomplete information on the wrong timeline. It does end up getting quite problematic. Then with privilege and scarcity. So one of the most interesting conversations I ever had was about 10 years ago. I was interviewed for CNN International, and I asked the anchor at the time, who was traveling around Africa, what he thought the biggest issue was going to be in his career as an anchor in anchoring this international TV show in Africa. And he told me water, which was not what I expected for someone who was basically the most beautiful person I'd seen with no environmental background whatsoever. And it's true, natural resources are the new conflict barrier. So Arab Spring, for example, came after one of the worst droughts in that region because scarcity makes people be desperate. It makes them do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. So we have this scarcity barrier, and at the same time, privilege and money hides the impacts of climate. You know, I see that having grown up, spending some of my life in America, in the United States, where, yeah, if you have money, you don't feel the impacts of climate change, but that's changing. And so what I worry about sometimes is we literally have Pacific Island nations who will be underwater. And so they will have a sociological tipping point where it becomes relevant to them much sooner than some of the more wealthy nations. And we know the tipping points are coming for each country. You know, money only hides the impacts of climate for so long, but whether those are timed at the same time, I worry about. There's a gender and equity piece. So women and minorities are just not included in the conversation. It's changing, but I would say we still have a long way to go. And so what I've done here, I've done a screenshot of this quote. Does anybody know who said this? Or does anybody want to guess who said this about Greta Thunberg?
I think Donald Trump.
Not Donald Trump, surprisingly for once. I don't know if someone else had an answer. I didn't hear it, but it's not Donald Trump. This was Bill. This was Bill Gates in an interview with The Guardian this month. So Bill Gates gave. Oh, does everyone mind muting themselves if they're not speaking? Thank you. So this was Bill Gates in an interview this month with The Guardian, and he's just published a phenomenal book on his thoughts on how we can fix climate change. But I find this kind of commentary, it's not helpful. Greta Thunberg is the voice of a generation. And I noticed when she started her Friday School protest, I had a couple of CEOs. One guy in particular sits in my mind, and he's the CEO of one of the largest construction companies in Europe. We had a chat on the phone. He said, my son asked me at breakfast what I'm going to do about climate change. What do you think I should do? And it was because of Greta Thunberg. So I think we need to really reflect on that gender and equity and that generational shift, the culture change that's already happening. Human psychology is a funny thing. We've known since the 60s, the oil and gas companies have known since the 60s. I mean, the science is pretty clear. If you put things in the atmosphere, the climate will change. But watching how people, they find it, I think it's hard for people to change their assumed future of what the future will look like, especially when it's quite negative. And now we're seeing that. I mean, COVID, to me, this has been a rapid change in people's assumed futures, where they thought they were going. And it's been a very interesting experiment for me to see how society copes with so much change, because I think the same thing's happening when you look at climate change. And so one of the earliest lessons that I learned is that if it was just about the numbers, then everybody would be making decisions that make the most sense to them. But it's not. It's about convincing people. There's a degree of people putting their head in the sand, and how we gently pull people out and get them to do something. I think while we're having this cultural shift happening so rapidly, will be something that many of you have to deal with in your careers. We don't speak the same language. The number one reason why I did this Quantic MBA is because businesses do not speak in the same language. And I'm not talking just about English here, but like the technical words as academics NGOs, as government, and it's a real problem. So everyone's reinventing the wheel over and over again and not talking to each other. And I think those of you in this course, even if you don't do sustainability programming, I mean, if you are learning how to understand what sustainability experts can say to you, then I think you do have a step up on your other colleagues who are not taking this as seriously. And then one last point about innovation. I think it's awesome that innovation is now front and center. I think Elon Musk has his innovation fund. Everybody wants to innovate our way out of this. And I think that's just a human desire to have a quick, there's no vaccine for climate change. I wish there was, but to have a quick solution. But what I fear is that this is giving people false hope. We won't just be able to innovate ourselves out of this. We need real change. We need cultural change, and we just need to get the basics right. Like governments and companies don't do environmental impact assessments still, even though it's 2021. So I think learning that, yes, catchphrases and exciting things get people interested, but what we really need to do within that is to keep pushing that we just do the basics right. I was asked to reflect on what sustainability means to me. And I understand that I'm coming at sustainability from a quite narrow focus. So it's environmental. I'm not thinking about the human piece, and I think other of these Quantic meetups will touch on what sustainability in the round means. But for me in the short term, I'm not interested in the whole world going vegan and everything being green. But if everybody could just be a bit greener, a bit faster, and we get the basics right, I think that's the starting point, is to get people really interested and not have it be this all or nothing, quite politicized discussion. And then in the longer term, what really needs to happen, and I think where in your careers, depending on, maybe regardless of what industry you're in, one of these will come up, which is we need to internalize the externalities, all of our impacts and dependencies on nature. We have to internalize that into our decision making, which goes back to the natural capital accounting I talked about. This has to be resourced like the crisis it is. So what I find interesting is that before the COVID crisis, the fastest developed vaccine in the world was the MMR vaccine, which took 4 years to develop. We were able to develop, science was able to develop multiple COVID vaccines in less than a year, I think. And that is what happens when governments, businesses, and society thinks that something is important. And I think we need to start doing the same thing with climate change, which of course then leads to the policy point. So governments we're seeing what I think is close to a tipping point. Voters are seeing the impact of climate change so that governments are not forced to act on it. What I think is probably most relevant to everyone here, businesses must protect their supply chain. Those that do, those that realize that this matters, will 100% do better than those that don't. We already starting to see the pension funds, which consider sustainability, are outperforming pension funds that don't. And I think as a short anecdote here is I did meet once with the CEO of Java House, which is like the Starbucks of East Africa. And I asked him, their model was that they would put coffee shops around East Africa, but they would source all of their farm produce locally and it was organic and whatever. But when I asked him whether he was considering climate change in his model for where he was going to scale out, the answer is no, which is ridiculous. East Africa already has water shortages. And I just remember thinking, okay, this guy, he's going to lose money. You can't put, coffee houses in Ethiopia and not think about water availability if your whole USP is that you're getting like locally sourced lettuce. So anyway, all this to say, businesses that realize that this is a risk early on, I think will outperform those that don't. And then just for you as individuals, I always find it interesting that we are in the generation and our kids are in the generation who will be impacted by by climate change. And I still, people still buy houses in flood zones. In England, everyone's buying houses in flood zones. And I just wonder, okay, 10, 20, 30 years, this is going to cost you a lot of money. So there are decisions that you can make at an individual level with your pension funds. It is quite a privileged position to be able to make these kinds of decisions. But if you do have that privilege, I would highly suggest that you try to think about that longer timeline because it will benefit you and your kids. So to end on a positive note, because I know we had some negative, covered some negative ground there, is that I actually feel quite positive, more positive than I have in the rest of my career. As of yesterday, I did a Google search. Things seem to be heating up. So Facebook says they're net zero. You have US and China agreeing to cooperate on climate change, and it's like basically the only thing they see eye to eye on at the moment. And I want to point out that this is because John Kerry, I mean, since he's come in as Biden's climate envoy, the entire global discussion on climate has changed. There's hope, you know, the US is behind this. And I think it goes to show that individuals can still make a huge positive difference. And then, of course, you've seen the UK and the US just setting these ridiculously ambitious emissions target, which I think we need. We need governments to lead, just as we need business to lead with innovation. So I do think that this is quite positive. I think there's a long way to go, but our generation of MBA graduates really will be at the center of this, I think, pushing this all forward. So I'm really pleased that you're listening to these chats and thinking about it now. So with that, let me wrap up my talk. I'm really interested to hear how the discussion sessions go, and I hope you found something useful out of this presentation. Thank you.